This is The View from Where We Live. The View from Where We Live, where we'll take a look at the stories of our time.
Welcome. This is The View from Where We Live. I'm your host, Mary Eckert, and today we have a really special program. In 1963, those of us who were living are now probably, in our 50s. We remember where we were during the lunch hour of November 22nd, 1963. I personally was standing in the doorframe of Robert McAlone's biology classroom at Urban Middle School, it was then Urban Junior High, and my guest, Mike Zeller, was at a Milwaukee Walgreens lunch counter, and everybody was crying. My guest today is Mike Zeller, and Mr. Zeller, why don't you tell us why you were crying?
Well, it was, it was that day I was with my mom and my aunt, and we were visiting her in Milwaukee. Mm-hmm. And, it was a really nice day, and it was, around the holiday season. And we were at the lunch counter having our lunch, and all of a sudden, at that time, it was Walgreens, that was a big place to eat back then. And very loud, everybody hustle and bustle during the holiday. And a lot of noise, and all of a sudden over the PA system came a special announcement, and it said that President Kennedy had been shot. And it was just dead silent. You could hear a pin drop in the restaurant. And people just started to sob and cry. And I looked at my mom, because I was very young at the time. And
you said 4 years old?
Yeah. I looked at her and I said, why is everybody crying? And she said, well, the president had been shot. So, but remembered very distinctly of sitting at the counter and people crying and just being that quiet. So it's very different.
So Mike was 4 years old then. Today he is a corporate executive chef working in Chicago. Yes. You have a history in Sheboygan. You were a 1978 graduate of North High. Right. And you were a chef at Rupp's. You were a major player at Johnsonville. Right. And now you are working in Chicago. Yes. So also you are a 1978 graduate of North High School. You are also the only living person that can tell the story we're going to tell today, which is that your father was involved with making
the casket of John F. Kennedy.
Right. And we are eager to tell the story, starting with how did Sheboygan get the job, a casket showroom in Dallas or Washington? Who called? What's the government looking? What was Washington looking for? Don't answer yet.
Don't worry.
Don't answer yet. Was this a casket off the line for a murdered American, or was it the best one ever manufactured for a slain American president? When we were researching this, you had told me this story a number of years ago, and then I tiptoed around funeral homes in Sheboygan trying to, who knows about this? Nobody knew. And it's a story your family was kind of living with because, according to the internet, there's no mention of Sheboygan. But the fact is that Sheboygan Casket Company, which was located just south of Trilling Hardware, got shells from the Elgin Casket Company, which is the manufacturer of one of the coffins that President Kennedy was laid in. So why don't you go from there and tell us how these caskets, what happened in Elgin, what happened in Sheboygan, and just kind of describe.
Sure. I mean, from what I remember, my dad worked there his entire life, and I even worked there after school and, get some money when I was younger and in high school. But the Elgin, there would be a number of different companies that would bring in caskets, and the shell is just the metal box that they would come in, and they would come in just primered, sprayed. And what would happen once they came in is there were different companies that would bring them in. There would be solid copper, there would be solid bronze, which is the one that the president was put in. There was wood, and then just basic steels. And they would bring them in, and they would paint them, and they would first come in and they would look at them just like a car. I mean, it was like a Rolls Royce. They're considered the Rolls Royce caskets. And they would look and see if there's any dings or dents in it, and they would fill it and primer it. And then they would go to my dad, and my dad was the sprayer. And he would put the colors onto them. And
what kind of color?
I mean, there was, you know, soft baby blues and browns and just just about any other color you can imagine. And it was kind of amazing back then because so many people would handle. I think there was probably about 35 people that
35 employees, right?
That worked in the plant, and
25 you said were involved per casket.
Per casket, because there was a number of ladies that were third floors where they did all the interior. And there was a number of ladies. Not every lady would touch every single casket. There was always, you know, 2 or 3 that would do it on that. That's why it kind of shrinks down from 35. But it would normally come in, and then they would go up to the upstairs, which was floor 5.
There were five floors. Okay, just.
And the 5th floor is where it basically started, and that was the floor where they would come in and they would check and get everything, the dings and the dents out, and then they would get them sanded down.
It started on 5 and worked its way down out the back door. Okay.
And they would start, and they would do
on 5.
On 5, and they would get the dings, the dents out, primer them up, sand them so they were just smooth as glass, and then if they needed what was called like debrushing, and that would put like these really long scratches into it, that would have to go down to another floor and be done.
Okay.
And then they would bring them back
to get
up.
the scratches out.
Get the scratches. Actually, they would put them in.
Why did they put scratches
because
in?
it was a length of the casket. They would have this huge sander, and they would run it, and it would put it in to give depth to the metal. Like they would do it a lot of times. You would see that in the solid bronze and the solid coppers because of how it would glimmer with those little edges into it. It just it's really nice. So then they would go back upstairs, and then my dad would spray whatever color was chosen, because back then, you know, there was a lot that they would do. A typical model would be a certain color. But you could also go and say, I'd really like this in blue with silver onto it. And then they would customize it because it was a custom made. And there would be different colors. So he would spray all these beautiful colors onto it. And the funny thing is, you know, now you go into a store and you want color matched, and they have to do it all computer. He wouldn't even hardly measure. He would grab gallon containers, and he would put it through the strainers. And he would just grab, you know, this color and that color
And
that,
just pour it in.
And pour it in freehand. And the amazing thing is, if something would get scratched and they would send it back, he could come back and he would put it in, and you couldn't even see the difference. I mean, that's how good he was at doing it. It was really interesting. And he would then, you know, go and spray the entire casket. And the funny thing is that they would do shading. And, you know, just these sometimes fine lines or, you know, a wider spray. And I always laugh because my dad could write better with a spray gun. You know, he'd have something on the wall and he could put his name onto the wall. Then he could write with a pen and paper, you know, a pencil. You know, I always laughed at that. I'm like, you're the only guy I know that can write better in paint than, you know, handwriting.
I don't know what a spray. The spray gun is it's as little as a.
I mean, it's a smaller one. And normally, you know, for people that are out there, you see the normal spray guns that are out.
So you said you told me a long time ago your dad did the detailing. Is that beyond this brush?
He did anything.
Painting.
The painting, the debrushing, what was called was done by a different person. Anything that involved paint was my dad. My dad was the only person that painted there.
Yeah. But now, is detailing like the stripe on a car, or
no?
They don't have that.
Yeah,
on a
there's
car.
not really that definition on caskets of pinstriping. It's more of shading. You know, where you would come up and put an edge maybe an inch or inch and a half wide, or you know, even smaller. You know, where you would come up, if you've ever, you know, everybody's seen a casket at one point in time where the colors change and how they blend together.
Oh, right.
And he would blend those. And just a lot of really interesting things. And then they would use what was called hot lacquer. And there was lacquer that they would heat up. And what would help that was it would flow it out. And that's where I think the Rolls Royce came in, because it would look like a Rolls Royce finish. Just perfect. There was never any little, you know, pieces of dust or dirt in. And then there was always, after they dried, they went into another room on the 5th floor. And then I remember the one gentleman's name was Ralph. I can't remember his last name. He would be the person that would buff them out. And I mean, just like an automotive, they would sand them down, water sand them really fine, and then buff them out with, you know, certain grits of polishing compound, and then put just this exquisite, and they would actually have waxes and like automotives would. And then they would go from there down to the 3rd floor, where they would put on the hardware, which is the handles on the outside and the holding things, and then they would do the interiors, which were really fine silks and linens, and there were a lot of caskets that had box springs and mattresses. Ooh. I always thought that was, you know, kind of funny, because I'm like, who cares at that point in your life if you're comfortable? And then they would do the inside, and some of them they would sew into like some of the what was called the hood, was the part when you're laying there that's open to you where you can see. And some of them I remember that would be like a darker color, and then they'd have this sparkly thread sewn in, so it almost looked like when you were gazing, if you were up north and looking at the stars, would be how the top would be. But they also had other ladies that would, you know, they could pleat and would do things like that.
In the research I did at Mead Library, it said that President Harold Carey, who founded the company in Sheboygan in October 1935, said the company was a recognized leader in the industry for its delicate needlework. The sewing machines would sew simultaneously with 10 needles, and the women converted bolts of silk and other fine cloths into dozens of intricate designs, in contrast to years when plain black broadcloth was used for the interiors. So I think Sheboygan really had a reputation, and I just think it's so fascinating to hear stories about your dad, people who built the people who built Sheboygan and gave it its reputation for being so good. Keep going with it.
I mean, there was a lot of things. I mean, you were talking about the 10 needles, you know. And if you think about it, that's in the 60s. That's so state-of-the-art from back then. I mean, I remember there were times where you would see things in the casket where, you know, there was detail of almost like hand spraying and things. And they would do that with needle. You know, they would run it on their sewing machines and could do, you know, like crosses.
No, it wasn't computerized, but and they just move the material, move one piece of material, and 10 of them would happen.
Well, there'd be 10 needles on that. Well,
10 needles on one piece of fabric.
And they could do it. So I think it was a multiple needle that would do it. And it was just very interesting seeing some of it. And I mean, they would even get in like, you know, huge bales of cotton to do the stuffing. And I remember those because they were like 5 feet by 4 feet and weighed, you know, hundreds of pounds. And they had machines that they would roll them in that would, you know, kind of rip it apart and blend it.
And the Sheboygan funeral homes really relied on the casket company. They'd call in the morning, pick it up at night, and
they could do that. Was
pull up the hearse to the back and come in and, you know, talk to everybody. And
they were. It was really funny, the funeral homes in Sheboygan. I mean, I would, as a young kid, I remember my dad knowing a lot of the people, and you know, everybody knew who my dad was. So.
And your uncle was?
My uncle was Richard Zeller. He was, I believe,
executive.
He was an executive. He was superintendent for a while, and then I believe he became vice president.
And Mike was the floor sweeper.
And I was the floor sweeper after, you know, after school, you know, a couple times a week, and would do that. So I mean,
tell us some names. Who are the people that?
Harry
Anderson.
Harry Anderson.
David Ivey.
David Ivey was there.
Joan Stricker.
And there's
Niles Parzig was later the president.
And there's you know, there's so many other names that, you know, I just kind of forget who they were all. And there was Ralph, who worked on my dad's floor. He was a polisher. I remember him because he was, you know, my dad was a big fisherman. So and so was Ralph. So they kind of bonded like that outside of work. But there was a lot of different people into it, and you know, it just was a very neat group of
family,
people. Very family, but
I bet
kind
people
of,
didn't quit and come and
No, that was
you were there.
You were there.
And
you were there.
in those years, you were there.
And I remember my dad. I think he worked for a dairy delivering milk for a while. He did some other things, but I know the whole time he had worked there until his retirement.
How did this story get so established with your family? I mean, none of the funeral people knew because.
I mean, it was something that was brought up when we were little. He said that we sprayed John F. Kennedy, and that was pretty much it wasn't like something that came up every day. But it was just something that came up, and we said we did a special casket. There was a number of other special caskets that they've done throughout their career. That I think we have talked about, and there may be some other ones.
The famous caskets from the casket company. I have those stories.
You want to talk about later?
Later, but just before we get too far astray from the Kennedy story, there is some really interesting Kennedy lore from these caskets. Kennedy was actually had two caskets. And the first one was this Elgin Company casket, and the notes that I took from the internet were it was a Handley Britannia. It cost about $4,000, and it was delivered to Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas by the Vernon O'Neill Funeral Home, and it became too bloodstained to use, but it was the transport casket because it became too bloodstained. And so the body was then transported to Washington, and the Gawler's Funeral Home in Washington worked for 3 hours on the body, and then they put it in a Marcellus 710 coffin, hand-rubbed 500-year-old African mahogany, so we know that was not the Sheboygan casket, but the O'Neill Funeral Home is the one with the interesting story because Gawler's then stored the transport casket, and it later, after it was not used, it was put in storage, and later in Arlington, not in Arlington, after the funeral, the Air Force came and took that casket because the Kennedy family wanted it out of the picture. O'Neill, the original funeral home director, wanted it back because there was a dispute over how much he was going to get paid for it, and he wanted to use it, to show, this is what I did, and they said, yeah. So the transport casket was put in storage, and at 10 a.m. on February 18th, 1966, Air Force transport plane went over the Atlantic 100 miles out east of Washington, D.C., descended 500 feet above the water, drilled holes, the casket was drilled with holes and filled with sand and secured so it wouldn't break on impact. They descended to 500 feet above the water and pushed open the tail hatch, pushed the casket out, parachute softened the fall, and it sank instantly. The plane circled for 20 minutes so that they didn't see it resurface. And then, very interesting, later when Kennedy's son, John, died, his casket, was taken 100 miles from the drop zone of his father's casket, and the son was buried at sea. But even earlier than that, Jackie Kennedy wanted to replicate Lincoln's funeral, and when they saw the interior of this transport casket, they knew it could not be used. But when Gawler's did the work on the body, and it was all done very early in the morning, and 4 a.m., Bobby and Jackie took the body in the hearse to the White House, to the East Room. They asked the lid be opened, and Jackie snipped a lock of hair with the scissors, and then the casket was closed forever, and the rest is history. But when the body was buried, President Kennedy had been to the cemetery, I don't know how much earlier, and he saw this particular site, and he said, I could live here, I could stay here forever. and that's where he is. So it's just a very interesting legacy for Sheboygan. What we thought was an urban legend is a legacy.
It's you know, it's 100% not sure. You know, we're not 100% sure. I mean, that's something we've heard of. And
but
the casket
there's a
company,
very likely connection.
Where they had, you know, where they would purchase the shells from is one of the same companies that they had used. And so, you know, from everything that I understand and remember, and, you know, that's always been what it is.
So your father wondered for the rest of his life.
That's where it went, you know. And even though the one that he, you know, was final in was the wooden one. I mean, we know that's not the one because that's not a company they purchased from. But they also did wooden ones also. So, but it's just it's a really neat tie back and something neat that, you know, knowing about the city of Sheboygan, the people that work here, you know, had an intricate part in history.
And just what it says about Sheboygan, that Sheboygan had the kind of people that would work that hard and be that,
you know,
do that well.
Do that well and be that professional. If it's not something you put up on a billboard and say, look what we did. You know, it was something we did. And
but there are a lot of companies now who boast that Sheboygan County has the people who will get the job done.
This area is, you know, is just, it's a great group of people that live in this city. They're, you know, like anywhere else, there's some very hardworking people and there's not. But overall, I think this whole area is very concerned of the quality and the craftsmanship of what they do every day. So it's very interesting. Okay,
before we wrap it up, there are some funny stories about the casket company. And two of them, the first one I'll just mention is there was a man from California who wanted to be buried standing up, and Sheboygan Casket Company came through with that one. Then there was the better ones. The better story is we found at Mead Library is, I hate to say this, the overweight lady from the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus. Her death was hardly routine. She had a 600-pound body, and it was a problem when she died. They could hardly get her out of her mobile home near Baraboo, and the coffin was even more perplexing, and Sheboygan was the one that came through in the end with the final product.
I remember hearing about that one when I was
Well, your uncle, Richard Zeller, was the plant superintendent and treasurer, and he gave this report talking about how they, split open two caskets.
Threw them into about 2/3 on each side, I believe it is, or something like that, and kind of welded them together.
Workmen selected an ordinary coffin measuring 6 feet 6 inches long, which is suitable for vast majority of people, and quartered it. They then added plywood to extend it in all directions and 2x4s for reinforcement. The end product truly was unique, and by no means did it solve all the problems confronting mourners. For while the casket now could accommodate the circus performer, it could no longer fit through the funeral home door. To all for visitation, a large bay window had to be removed to provide access and egress for the coffin. And it goes on and on. And the burial required 2 adjoining cemetery plots. One of several special orders ever received by the Sheboygan Casket Company. So it just does really have quite a history, and
it was a very unique, you know, building. I know there were people that would walk in front, and some people would walk across the street.
Yep.
They wouldn't even want to walk on the same sidewalk as the building was.
Too, you know. Any other like really light moments that you remember?
I mean, I remember, you know, friends that would come with, you know, when I was
to work there, high school friends.
Oh my gosh, you would just, they would be so freaked out. They would be like, "Did you really do this?" You know.
And did they go in and look at them? And
they would, but they were always kind of very cautious. They were like one step heading back to the door. Especially when I was done at night, I would have to turn all the lights off, and that'd be, you know, I mean, even at times I think I ran a little bit, and I was brought up with it, so it didn't make a difference for me.
That was another comment in one of the stories at Mead Library, was that the employees, when asked, you know, what's it like working at a casket company? Oh, it's just like making bathtubs. So
it really, I mean,
yeah.
I guess nobody, you know, and including myself, I never thought of it like that.
Because you didn't know any different.
You don't know any different, and I mean, it's like bathtubs to people that work at Kohler or wherever.
Kohler, yeah.
You know, it's a shell. You're not thinking of where and what's going to go into the box after. So,
Yeah.
you know, but it was always fun. You know, it was kind of a joke, and people always used to go, "Can we get one for Halloween that we could use?" You know, and I'm like, "No, I don't think that."
No, I don't think that works. No.
So.
But the coffins that we talked about were like $4,000. Do you have any clue what they cost today?
Oh,
I
have
mean, like
no,
tens
but
of thousands.
if you think of what $4,000 was in the early '60s, I mean, people were probably, that was pretty close to almost what they were making for income for, you know, incomes were probably eight maybe $10,000 a year, if that. So it was
Sizable.
huge amount of money.
Yeah.
And considering, you know, the big boys that were out there would be a lot less. So.
Okay. We are ready to wrap up. No. Okay, we're not ready to wrap up. The casket company had so many people. I found so interesting. I didn't know the stories about the kids coming from your high school, you know, high school friends coming. Tell me more about that, because these are people who will be watching this now, and they'll think, "Oh my gosh, Mike Zeller's telling about us."
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to mention names.
No.
There's probably a few of them here. Yeah. That just would come, you know, down, and we'd see, you know, some days after school we'd go and I'd say, you know, hi to my dad or whatever, and you know, people would watch. I mean, it was very loud in there because of the exhaust fans and things that were always on there, and loud machinery, and it's kind of funny because, you know, I talked very loud, and my dad always did because of the environment they were in. Because that was really a lot before the years of OSHA, where, you know, earplugs and ear protection and respirators were all there. So, you know, my friends would come along and they would look at me and they go, "Well, now I know why your dad talks so loud," you know, because it's just so loud in there. And they were always amazed that, you know, they'd go back to that piece, I think what we had talked about, of how my dad would mix colors and paints without measuring things.
Yeah. And that would never be done now.
Oh, it would never be done.
Never.
And I know when he retired just a few years before they had, you know, gone out of business, you know, the new owner, whoever took over, said, "Well, where's your paint book?" And my dad said, "Right here." It's all in his head. And that's where it was. It was amazing.
And the sad part is that that company closed, we speculate, because of the big manufacturers mass producing.
Sure.
And isn't it even to the point now with like they just
They're like,
stick in the interiors and
It's a
what
cookie
color do you want? What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? We assemble it and there you have it.
where, you know, back in the days of
They made
Sheboygan
it,
casket, you wanted a box spring and mattress. You could have a box spring and mattress. You wanted a bronze casket with, you know, certain color hardware. You could have all that. You know, it was customizable, where now it's not. So.
Yeah. So it's just
It's
it's
a
just
lot
part of
different
the whole
nowadays,
change.
and that's, you know, it's sad to see go, but you know, that's the way the world's going.
So now you still have a home in Sheboygan,
I still have a
but you
home.
live in Chicago.
I live in Chicago, you know, during the week, and I come home on the weekends. Not the world's greatest way to do it, but I love it here. I really enjoy, you know, the area. You know, been gone and moved around and done a few things, but you know, this is home. It always has been. It's a great group of people here, and I love the lake.
Yeah.
You know, it's such a beautiful area, so really enjoy it.
Well, I think with that, we are going to wrap it up. I want to thank my guest today, Mike Zeller. I'm your host, Mary Eckert, and I do hope we have enhanced the view from where you live.